those quality programs.
Speaking as a member of the public who could only watch from afar, I think people were shocked, and that shock only compounded as the weeks went on, that it seemed like nobody knew what to do. There were these speculative, jargony, inside the industry responses. Well, if this doesn't work, then we'll try this, then we'll try this. Probably in business schools around the world, they're wargaming this and realizing that if you're going to have a massive, disastrous event in your company, don't put a camera right next to it unless you know damn sure that you can end it fairly quickly, because you could go online every day and watch oil cascading into the Gulf of Mexico while everybody scratched their heads. And it was shocking to people that nobody knew what to do about it. So.
Ray, there's another course or lesson that ought to be taught in business schools and probably other areas, and that is that the time to be planning for a crisis is not while the crisis is underway. You need to do anticipatory planning. If I could be parochial for a moment, I have thought and talked some about the difference between the science that is being used in the restoration of the Everglades, which is very much anticipatory in nature, and the science that was used here, which was an after the crisis had started. The containment and response was a particularly distressing area. It certainly underscored Bill's point of the fact that this was not just one rogue company. There was an industry failure to focus on containment and response. Bill, as the head of EPA, had presided over, presided over the aftermath of the largest spill prior to Deepwater Horizon, which was Exxon Valdez. And when we began to look at this disaster, Bill, from a very experienced background, commented that there'd been virtually no improvement in the capability to contain or respond in the 20 years since Exxon Valdez. So those were serious indictments, not just of BP, but of the industry's response to what turned out to be a very significant and unprepared for crisis.
It was interesting that even 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks in, neither any of the companies involved nor the federal government could give a reasonably accurate estimate of how much oil was flowing into the Gulf. That was shocking. That was shocking. Well, how come no one knew how much oil was flowing into the Gulf, Mr. Reilly?
Well, the whole nature of our response planning that is embodied in the laws really contemplates that the responsible party has the action. And there are several reasons for that. One, I suppose, is just expense. The government doesn't want to invest in the kinds of technologies that would allow it to do so. This hadn't been experienced before. Deepwater situations pose many higher risks and much more complexity. It has to be, everything that's done at level of 5,000 feet down has to be done by robots. But the determination of the flow rate is a really fundamentally important fact. It affects things like decisions to throw golf balls down the hole. If you know that you've got a flow rate that is 20,000 or 30,000 barrels coming out, it's very different from if it's one, which is what was thought for several weeks going into the spill. Second important part about flow rate, and the reason that we recommended the government develop this specific technology, because it so much depends on it, is eventual litigation will look at the Clean Water Act violations and relate it directly to the amount of the flow rate and the amount of volume that was spilled. We are assured now that the capability exists in the government. The USGS, Marsh McNutt, and others have said that next time, if there is a next time, there will be an independent capability on the part of the government to assess the flow rate, which is very important. And I must say, one of the more positive bits of ingenuity in the entire experience was when Secretary Chu and a team, largely based on his laboratories and Energy Department laboratories, figured out the flow rate and how to calculate it.
If I could just follow up on what Bill said, the Secretary Chu's involvement, and he brought not only the title of Secretary of the Department of Energy, but the medal of being a Nobel Prize winner to assemble a phenomenal group of scientists to answer this question of the flow rate. But it was done on an ad hoc basis and very much the product of the personality of the convenor. We're suggesting that that needs to be more institutionalized so it doesn't depend upon having a charismatic leader who can do this. And that as a general proposition, that there needs to be more outreach to the scientific community, both that is within the federal government, but not necessarily in the Department of Interior, and to the broader academic and non-governmental scientific community, so that all those talents can be institutionalized to facilitate a response to a disaster such as this. I might say there probably are applications of that concept in other areas where the federal government is called upon to be involved in a major disaster, whether it's an act of God or an act of man, such as a deep shaft mining disaster.
The report was very tough on the government. Apart from Secretary Chu, there wasn't a lot of love in there for the response of the United States government on this. Where did it fall down in its response to the blowout?
Well, it has fallen down for a long time. There has been a failure to adequately recognize the importance of effective regulation. The budgets for the key agencies have essentially been flatlined over the last 20 years, while the risk of operations has been dramatically increasing, and therefore would lead one to believe that there is a greater need for regulatory oversight. There also had been a cozy relationship between the regulator and the industry, and in part that was a fundamental conflict of interest. The same entity that was responsible for maximizing revenue through royalties into the federal treasury, and as an aside, next to the income tax, the royalties from this industry are the second largest source of income to the treasury. At the same time, that agency was asked to oversee safety. So you can imagine if the question is, should I spend an additional 30 days reviewing this permit application, or should I get this well underway so that it can produce 30 days earlier the revenue that we are being urged to provide, which lost out? Obviously, safety was the casualty in that conflict. So we feel that one of the most important recommendations that we're making is that the safety function within the Department of Interior be an independent function to the degree that it can be within a department of the federal government. I use as a rough analogy the FBI within the Department of Justice. The director of the FBI does not serve at the pleasure of the president. He or she serves a fixed term. We're recommending that the head of this safety agency serve a fixed term and that it have a singular focus on safety with no other conflicting obligations.
Well, Mr. Reilly, you were a regulator. You were a provider of oversight. What's the right relationship between an industry that's producing, as the senator mentions, so much revenue, and yet one that has the potential for really catastrophic environmental impact? How do you calibrate that relationship in a way that maximizes protection and maximizes return under that carapace of protection?
Frankly, to get the kind of independence for the safety and environment regulator that we consider appropriate. And by the way, the United Kingdom, Norway, in the North Sea, both have done, each after their own catastrophes, totally walled off, in fact, in separate ministries in both of those governments. We seriously considered whether the function should even remain at the Department of the Interior. I think a realistic assessment of where things are in this city and at this moment, we chose to recommend that, yes, it stay there, but entirely walled off in the way that Bob described. The proper functioning, I think, of the entire regulatory apparatus would be much improved if there were an organic statute, of which there is none, governing the old MMS or BOEMRE, that prescribed its responsibilities and made very clear that with respect to regulation of environment and safety, no one concerned for or having authority with respect to revenue is even involved. If you look at the kind of mission that the agency has been given, and 3 MMS directors who spoke with us confirmed, it says promote offshore oil and gas, promote oil and gas development, revenue generation, and also look out, by the way, very much is the way I read it, for the risks and safety and environment. It's a conflicted message, and it's not surprising that revenue has historically driven the enterprise.
If I could just expand on that, I think it's fundamental to understand that the federal government has 2 roles as it relates to offshore oil and gas. One is as a regulator, primarily for safety and environmental protection. But the second role is the landlord role. The Gulf of Mexico belongs to the people of the United States of America to the extent of our reach over that water body. And we are making a decision publicly to allow that property that belongs to all of us to be leased to a private firm for a specific time period and for a specific purpose. Just like any other landlord, if you would lease your property, you want to be sure that your tenant doesn't trash it while it's in occupation. So the federal government has a second important role as prudent landlord of the property of the people of the United States. I think that basic concept of that second role has largely been ignored at the foot of the holy grail of maximizing revenue.
And maximizing production. We slurp a lot of oil in this country, and anytime there's an attempt to examine that fact, the oil industry speaks up on behalf of maximum production. But in truth, no industry says, you know, you're right. You should really be looking over our shoulder. When I was a young reporter and covering the pulp and paper industry, which at the time was fouling waterways around the country and releasing unbelievable amounts of stuff into the air and water, they howled when earlier EPA administrators attempted to stop that from happening. They said, you're going to wreck our profit potential, you're going to make us uncompetitive with the rest of the world. When I covered heavy industry in the Great Lakes, they all resisted any attempt to regulate, threatening both a change to the profit profile, loss of jobs, loss of taxpayer revenue, loss of competitiveness. How do you put in, as you propose in the commission report, a new oversight scheme that does none of those things? No industry says, you're right, we've been bad boys and girls, come regulate us.
You know, I think industries can get much more involved in recognizing that that quality regulation is good for them. And one of the interesting discoveries we made in the course of this was that the oil and